All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for attending our group project presentation. We investigated steelhead restoration options for Canada de Santa Anita, located here in Santa Barbara County. My name is Brandon Bunderson. This is Matthew Myers, Chris Helmer, Amy Locke, and Dakota Corey. So to begin, a little bit about our fish. mykiss to many of us. Those of you that know anything about trout will recognize that it looks very similar to a rainbow trout. In fact, they're closely related. The southern steelhead is an anadromous fish, meaning that they spend most of their lives in the ocean, yet they migrate back to freshwater streams in order to spawn and rear their young. Decades ago, the southern steelhead numbered in the thousands, tens and thousands, but recently, they've declined to about 500 individuals. As a result of this, they've been protected under the Federal Endangered Species Act by NOAA Fisheries, and NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The waterways shown here are those that NOAA has designated as critical habitat for the survival of the southern steelhead. Within this region around here more locally, there's 4 primary rivers that contribute to southern steelhead populations: the Santa Maria, the Santa Ynez, the Ventura, and the Santa Clara. However, I want you to notice these smaller coastal secondary streams that also play an important part in the steelhead population. These streams are important because, unlike salmon, steelhead trout actually don't always return to their natal stream to spawn. They're very opportunistic, and so when their natal stream is not accessible, they will either wait it out or they'll migrate up another nearby stream. Onto our stream, Canada de Santa Anita, commonly referred to as Santa Anita Creek. You can see there it flows through Hollister Ranch and is located about 40 kilometers west of where we are right now in Santa Barbara. Our client, Hollister Ranch Owners Association and the Hollister Ranch Conservancy, has prioritized Santa Anita Creek for the restoration and recovery of southern steelhead. To give you a little bit of a better idea, this is the Santa Anita watershed, and the watershed is acting like a giant bathtub. It collects and holds precipitation, and then it drains down towards an outlet, in this case, the Pacific Ocean. Santa Anita Creek starts up in the Santa Ynez mountain range and flows down to the ocean about 8.5 kilometers. And the drainage of the watershed is about 8 square kilometers. Located about halfway up in the watershed, just within the border of Hollister Ranch, is a large boulder and bedrock waterfall. This becomes a natural barrier, in essence limiting further migration to steelhead. So this becomes our area of interest for our project, approximately 4.2 kilometers of stream that's accessible to steelhead migration. So beyond this natural barrier in our stream, we're also concerned with a number of other engineered barriers. We have a low-flow crossing located just below this small culvert shown here. There's also 4 Arizona crossings. These Arizona crossings are large concrete structures where the road crosses back and forth over the creek. And they're designed so normal flows go through the pipe there, but during flooding or high flows, it'll go up and over the concrete and then back down the apron on the other side. Additionally, we have a small dam on this stream, located right here about 1 kilometer up. The main road that provides access to the remainder of the ranch is shown here. And then the Union Pacific Railroad also crosses the stream on the tracks that run along the coast in this region. So we came up with 2 research questions to address these barriers and this problem of steelhead migration on Canada de Santa Anita. Number 1, is it feasible to remove these barriers to steelhead migration in Canada de Santa Anita? And number 2, if the barriers were to be removed, what would be the quantity and quality of steelhead habitat that would become available? We were granted access to these 2 reaches along the stream. Up nearing the natural barrier, our upstream area, and then down below from just above the dam out to the Pacific Ocean. To answer our research questions, we broke up our project into 3 components. We analyzed the dam for the risks and concerns with the removal of it, as well as the management of the sediment that has become impounded behind it. And we also analyzed the remaining barriers for the extent that they were affecting fish passage upstream. To answer our second question, we performed a site assessment for the availability and the suitability of steelhead habitat if they were able to migrate upstream. Our primary barrier, the dam, it's located about 1 kilometer upstream, as I mentioned, and it's 4.5 meters in height. It's mostly an earthen fill structure. So this concrete here is just a spillway sloping down the back side for when the flows are high enough. Also notice that it's no longer functioning as a dam to store water, but the area behind it has been completely impounded with sediment and other stream debris that's washed downstream. So, using soil sampling techniques, we are able to characterize the volume and the grain size distribution on the creek. We collected sediment samples to determine the volume, and then we also used fate and transport calculations to determine how the sediment would behave if it were to be released downstream. Getting my buttons mixed up here. We determined that the volume of the sediment is roughly 100,000 cubic meters. To give you an idea of how much that is, that's like covering a football field with dirt 25 feet deep. So, soil samples revealed that 62% of the impounded sediment consists of fine silt and clays. 35% were sands and 3% were gravels. After determining this distribution, we wanted to know how it would behave if it were all washed downstream. So to get you oriented, up at the top there, we have the dam with the impounded sediment area, and then you can follow downstream. The red is the main road crossing, the railroad tracks, and then you have the estuary area at the bottom there. Our sediment calculations revealed that the majority of the impounded sediment, the silts and clays, would become suspended in the water column by the stream and either be flushed down to the estuary to be deposited temporarily, or it would be flushed completely to the ocean where the estuary's mouth to be open. This remaining sediment, the sands and gravels, would be deposited primarily between the dam and the railroad culvert. So the gravels and cobbles, the large grains, would be falling out of the water column first, as you can imagine, closer to the dam, and the sands deposited primarily near the main road and the railroad culvert. The deposition of these sands is a primary concern because it can impact the migration corridor to salmon or to steelhead upstream. And this can reduce the conveyance of these culverts by either causing flooding, impacting infrastructure, and then also, of course, reducing fish passage. Even though our dam is our primary barrier, we also needed to examine the extent to which these other barriers were affecting fish passage. So we identified 7 other additional barriers, and this is a stream elevational profile. On the y-axis on the left there, we have elevation in meters. The x-axis on the bottom is the stream length in meters. And this plots out and demonstrates all the barriers on the creek that we are able to identify. This is typical of the many challenges that steelhead face to migrate upstream on any given stream in California. California Fish and Game protocol was followed to examine the extent to which these barriers impacted upstream migration. And passage is dependent primarily on stream discharge, velocity, and depth. We were able to predict that only one of our barriers was able to facilitate steelhead passage for all age classes at all times, and that's the railroad crossing, the culvert over there on the left. Additionally, the low flow crossing was predicted to facilitate passage for adult steelhead on a limited basis. As you can imagine, most crossings, like those pictured in the middle, completely block fish passage. So to improve fish passage, there's a number of alternatives, two of which that have been recommended by NOAA Fisheries and the Department of Fish and Game are a bridge or a natural bottom arch culvert. Prefabricated bridges are a simple, cost-effective way to open the channel back up naturally and allow the stream to generate its natural gradient. The natural bottom arch culvert is good because it uses natural existing substrate in the bottom and it minimizes any drop that may come from the outlet. I'm going to turn the time over to Matt now to take you through the rest of our project.
Hello. Okay, so the next thing we looked at was the habitat. We wanted to determine if the habitat upstream of the barriers was adequate for the purpose of steelhead spawning and rearing. We used California Department of Fish and Game criteria that defines excellent steelhead habitat as having dense streamside vegetation consisting of mature trees and shrubs, frequent pools, high-quality spawning areas, cool summer water temperatures, complex in-stream habitat, a relatively intact floodplain as well. Well, in knowing these criteria, we had to divide our creek into the areas that had the best potential of meeting this criteria. That's designated as the spawning and rearing habitat, denoted by the yellow box on the screen. The rest of the habitat was designated as a migration corridor and would serve the purpose to only get steelhead from the ocean up to the better spawning and rearing habitat upstream. We determined that spawning and rearing habitat to have a better chance of meeting these criteria based on the fact that the slope in this portion of the creek was steeper, and as a result, coarser grained materials would be retained, which are good for steelhead spawning conditions. In addition, this area was also known to have a thick, dense riparian cover, which would help maintain cooler streams throughout the summer. As a result, we used our upstream study area to investigate for these criteria. I'll go over a couple of the more quantitative criteria that we actually analyzed for. The first one being the temperature. We placed a temperature data logger in the pool shown in the photo on the lower right-hand corner. We recorded temperatures from August of 2007 through January of 2008, as shown in the graph up on the right corner. The fluctuating line being the temperature, and the red band up at the top being actual lethal temperatures to steelhead. As you can see, through our study period, which was again from August through January, and included the end of summer, the temperatures never reached into the lethal temperature range. And as a result, we were able to say the temperatures were adequate for steelhead during our study period. Then we looked at spawning gravels. So steelhead require certain quality and quantity of gravels in order to spawn in. Particles should be gravel-sized and shouldn't be too fine or too coarse, coarser or finer than gravels. If they're too fine, steelhead or the eggs will become suffocated, and if they're too coarse, the steelhead will have trouble digging nests within the gravel bed. These two graphs show our results of two gravel beds that we encountered within our study area, both of which were adequate for steelhead spawning conditions. D50 indicates the mean grain size, and the bars indicate the number of grains that were found for each size class. Okay, so now we know a little bit about the sediment, or the impounded sediment behind a dam. We also know about the barriers on the creek, and we know a little bit about the habitat upstream of these barriers. And so we were able to draw conclusions based on our findings into the investigation of these. Our first conclusion we'll go over is habitat, in regards to the habitat. We determined that the habitat, according to the Department of Fish and Game criteria, is indeed suitable for steelhead spawning and rearing. We found that the riparian corridor, or the riparian cover, over the stream within our study area met the criteria and actually exceeded the criteria as established by the Fish and Game. We also observed cool water temperatures and high-quality spawning areas, as I mentioned before. And we found complex in-stream habitat as indicated by boulders, overhanging banks, overhanging vegetation, and woody debris, all of which give steelhead room to hide from potential predators. In addition, we found an intact floodplain indicated by a lack of erosion on the stream banks, as well as mature trees and shrubs lining the stream banks. Frequent pools were observed in the fact that we observed an average of one pool for every 55 meters of creek. And in conclusion, and outside of the criteria, we additionally observed trout in 2 of the pools. And we observed the trout at the end of summer, indicating that steelhead would have been able to rear throughout the summer. And this summer in particular is a good example because it was a record dry year. It's the driest year on record for this area. So it was extremely stressful on the steelhead. Okay, so we have our study area, which consisted of 500 meters of creek. We extrapolated that over what we determined to be our potential spawning and rearing habitat. And that was 2.4 kilometers of creek. And in doing so, we were able to estimate that there would be approximately 43 rearing pools and 10 spawning beds within this area. So now that we know that there's good habitat on our creek, it makes sense to take it to the next step and say, okay, what do we got to do to restore passage so that steelhead can get up to this good habitat? Well, the first barrier, a primary barrier, as Brandon mentioned, is the dam. We were able to determine 4 options for removing the dam for Hollister Ranch to better make a decision depending on their level of cost and risk. For each of our options, we were able to determine a relative level of cost and risk associated with each option. The costs range from $1 million to $3 million, and the risk was purely associated with the sediment impounded behind a dam and what would happen to that sediment if it were to be transported downstream, meaning the damage it might do to the downstream habitat, as well as the damage it might do to downstream infrastructure, such as the culvert. The costs associated with these potential damages were not factored into our cost estimate. That should be understood. I'll go over each one of the options. Our first option that we presented was complete dam removal with natural sediment transport. Under this option, the dam would be removed all at once, and the sediment behind the dam would be allowed to flush naturally downstream, basically as fast as the stream could carry it. As you would expect, under this scenario, you would have a high amount of risk. Once again, there's 100,000 cubic meters of sediment that would be potentially running downstream and potentially clogging culverts and damaging habitat. However, what makes this option attractive is the fact that it could be done quickly and probably have the lowest cost associated with it as well. Our second option is complete dam removal once again, but also with partial sediment excavation. So with this option, dam is removed all at once again, but then a portion of the sediment behind the dam would be removed, off-hauled off-site, disposed of, and ideally design a channel running through the impounded sediment. The remainder of the sediment, as much as possible, would be attempted to be stabilized in place using hard engineering structures such as concrete or riprap, or using vegetation, using vegetation. As a result, greater engineering expertise would be required and cost would increase as well. Our third option is similar. It's complete dam removal with complete sediment excavation. So once again, remove the dam all at once, but now remove all of that sediment, haul it off-site, and dispose of it. As you would expect, there's going to be a lot of costs associated with excavation, transportation, and disposing of all that sediment. However, the risk is minimized under this option. Our fourth option's a little bit different from the previous 3. It involves incremental dam removal with natural sediment transport. Under this option, The idea is that the height of the dam is lowered with time. With each incremental lowering of the dam, an amount of the sediment behind the dam would be allowed to flush downstream, and that's how the sediment would be managed. Now, this would there are costs that would accrue from this in that each time a portion of the sediment would be removed or a portion of the dam would be removed, you would have to mobilize the equipment on site as well as labor, and then you would have to monitor in between incremental removals to verify that the last slug of sediment that has flushed downstream adequately so as to reduce risk. Okay, that concludes our dam options. Since we know that there is an option for removing the dam, it makes sense to look into all the other barriers as well. Well, as Brandon mentioned, there are 6 culverts that prevent fish passage on our creek. We determined that removing these barriers was dependent upon the gradient of the stream at each culvert's location. As a result, we were able to make recommendations for each one of the crossings. The main road crossing, we recommended a natural bottom arch, and each Arizona crossing, we recommended bridges. Finally, the low flow crossing, we made the recommendation that they include a embedded culvert. The total estimated cost associated with these retrofits is expected to be about $2.5 million. So in conclusion, we were able to answer our research questions and state that we believe the results of our research allow us to conclude that there's indeed options for removing the dam and other engineered barriers that make it feasible for Canada de Santa Anita to contribute to restoring steelhead, and that by removing the engineered barriers, suitable steelhead spawning and rearing habitat will become accessible to steelhead. We would not have been able to make these conclusions without the assistance of our professor, Tom Dunn, Ann Coates of the Hollister Ranch Conservancy, the Coastal Ranches Conservancy, as well as the Hollister Ranch Owners Association, the Hollister Ranch Conservancy, for granting us the project and providing funding. Chris's dad, Greg Helmer, who assisted with the survey of the dam as well as the impounded sediment. Mark Capilli, Matt Stecker, Mo Gomez, and Tim Robinson provided their expertise as far as steelhead restoration and answered all our questions and reviewed all our reports. I also have to thank on behalf of our group all our loved ones who supported us through this project, and all of you for your interest in our project. Thank you very much.
Very nice job. We have just under 5 minutes for questions, so let's jump right in.
If you remove that sediment, where do you take it, and what impact will that have on your dumping ground?
Well, downstream, if you just let the sediment naturally go down, the impact would be on the downstream habitat that's below the dam and offshore on the potential tide pools that could be affected by a persistent flow of turbid water. So if you were forced to, or if you had to completely remove the impounded sediment, you would have to first determine if there's no contaminants within the sediment, and then you could either dump it somewhere and store it on the ranch itself, or you'd have to truck it to a disposal facility, which could be a little ways away.
So that figure you gave for the costs of restoring the habitat, who pays for that? Is it the ranch, or does it come from ESA funding, or what?
Well, currently there's actually quite a bit of hype surrounding steelhead restoration, and there's a plethora of public funding out there, both through private grants and through government agencies. And so it would be assumed anyways that a large majority of the project would be able to be covered through fundraising. There is definitely enough of an expense here that I would imagine some would need to be covered through private sources, Hollister Ranch, etc. But there is a lot of public funds available.
Did you look at the impact of getting heavy equipment into the areas that need to be repaired on the area itself?
We weren't able to get into that a whole lot. We did have numerous conversations and one site visit with a local contractor and excavator, and we were able to take his opinions into consideration. But a very obvious next phase in this project would be to gather more of an engineering assessment to get more of that information.
If the stream was restored, how many healthy trout do you think would live in it?
This is a really good question, and it's a question that a lot of biologists are trying to answer throughout the region. Unfortunately, it's hard to associate a number of trout with an area of stream available for spawning. We do have an estimate of the amount of stream that will become available from spawning, and so currently the stream has 2.4 kilometers of stream length that would support steelhead spawning, which we expect to have approximately 43 pools, 10 of which would be good for spawning itself. It would have appropriate gravels. If the dam and sediment were, or if the sediment were removed from the stream, additional spawning habitat would become available, and so the total amount would be 3.2 kilometers of spawning and rearing habitat. We think about 57 pools, 13 of which would have spawning gravel. Unfortunately, it's hard to take those numbers and put a direct link to the number of steelhead available. But if you think about the 13 pools which would support steelhead spawning because of the appropriate gravels, that's the possibility for maybe minimum 13 steelhead per year to come up and spawn. Again, because the numbers are so low of steelhead available in the ocean, the probability of them all coming at once is hard to determine.
On a related question, is there currently or has there been in the recent times any utilization of at least a lower accessible portion of the watershed by steelhead whatsoever?
That's also a good question. There are trout observed at various points in the pools. As Matt mentioned earlier, we saw trout in the upper reaches, which are above the barriers, so we're assuming those are coming from resident trout that have been living in the creek. And I don't know if it was covered clearly, but rainbow trout and southern steelhead are the same species. Southern steelhead are just rainbow trout that make it to the ocean and become anadromous, and they can contribute to each other's populations. Residents have seen rainbow trout throughout the creek, but we're not sure if those are coming from the upper reaches and working their way down, or if they're coming from the ocean and working their way up in the lower reaches.
Hi, I'm Charlie Eckberg. I have 30 years of experience on the Hollister Ranch, so a couple of things I'd ask if you looked at. The estuary itself that you refer to seems to me to be of extreme value given the quality of estuaries up and down the coast. So any risk to that needs to be looked at carefully. And then I was wondering if the Mykiss Dam in Ventura County, if the strategy for removing that was looked at for pluses and minuses that might be incorporated here.
We did look at the Mykiss Dam as part of our background literature review. However, because it is at such a big scale relative to the dam on Santa Anita Creek, we didn't find a lot of direct comparisons between the two.
And I can touch on a little bit the estuary part of your question. We do see the estuary as a very valuable resource on Santa Anita Creek. It's one of the remaining estuarine wetlands in Southern California, which is a specific type of wetland that has pretty much been wiped out. Our analysis of the estuary showed some pretty high summer temperatures this summer, and as we mentioned, it was a pretty extreme year. And so as far as providing steelhead rearing habitat, additional assessment needs to be taken over time to see what those temperatures look like on a more long-term basis, but we do think that it's a very beneficial portion of the creek.
I have a question. If the project were approved and went through to completion, to perfection, what kind of costs and effort is you expect for the future for maintenance of it so that it stayed pure and clean and good for perpetuity?
First of all, I'd say that would depend greatly on the option and the level of restoration that was taking place. Restoration being just your desired state, whatever that is. Obviously, if you're going to stabilize a large amount of that sediment, you're going to need to keep an eye on whether it's gabions or riprap or hard concrete structures in there. Those are going to have a life cycle that are going to need to be monitored. But if this entire sediment plain were to be removed, you have the opportunity to restore that whole reach to a natural state, planting native vegetation, not worrying about any artificial devices or infrastructure in there. And so if you're looking long-term, more natural, least cost, that may be something that you may want to consider. Obviously, that's going to be up to Hollister Ranch what route they want to go. But it's, I would say, without giving any numbers or a firm answer, it's just going to depend on your level of restoration.
Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much. Very interesting.